Welcome back, ladies, gentlemen, and MBs, and thank you for tuning back into St. Andrew TV, a cure for your Monday blues. I'm your host, Andrew, and today we have another cooking video for everyone. I'm assuming everybody knew that means there is a raw piece of meat sitting here in front of me, but what exactly are we doing with this raw piece of meat? Well, this is actually bison ribeye. And what we are doing with this bison ribeye, we are making nature's power bar, Pemmican. Nobody knows the exact date of when Pemmican was first made, but I can tell you that Native Americans and pioneers both used it effectively over the course of their travels, and it is a very universal survival food. So step by step, I am going to show you how to make pemmican. And side note, it's only 2 ingredients at its base form, not that difficult. So please sit back or follow along and make it with me here today. So first we are going to remove my beautiful buckskin gloves because we are about to cut into some raw meat. Now historically, this would be done with bison because it was a very prominent animal in the turn of the 18th century and 19th century. They said for every bison you could make about 90 pounds of pemmican. Now you will note throughout this entire process that weight is a very big component into making pemmican. The recipe that I found actually calls for 2 pounds of raw bison, and it's probably more in a roast form or the rump portion of the animal. I only had ribeyes available to me at my local grocery store, so it is a steak cut, so it's going to be a little bit more bougie, as I am a bougie bitch. Regardless of what cut of meat of the bison that you choose, this came off of a bison, therefore it is historically accurate. But this does come with sort of a caveat using a steak cut instead of like a big lump of meat, because you are going to try to get rid of most of the fat. You don't have to, but it's certainly going to make your life a lot easier in the future steps. So we are going to take our knife, and you can see how beautiful this ribeye is marbled. Unfortunately for us, it's not going to remain that way for long. So basically any white portion, any of the marbling you see, will have to be removed because the next step of the process does require it to be a pretty lean cut of meat. So as I said earlier, weight is a big component when you're making pemmican. And as I said, my recipe calls for 2 pounds of bison. Well, this is an 8-ounce cut of meat. I had to separate the 2 pounds that I got because this video otherwise would take about 28 to 32 hours to film. So I actually started late last night preparing dry meat. So the reason I'm bringing up the weight is because you are going to have to match it with the tallow, fat, suet, whatever you use to bind this all together once it's finally to its form. It's going to be a 1-to-1 trade-off. So if you use half a pound of bison, which is what this is roughly going to turn into once it is all manicured, you are going to use a half pound of animal fat to really make sure that it's nice and tidy. Now that I've completed cutting off the fat from the meat, I will like to add that when you do this, to make it easier to cut the meat into very fine slices to put on your drying rack, you're going to want to put this in the freezer if all possible for about 30 or so minutes to harden up the meat so it's easier to slice very finely. Obviously, you also heard that we're not going to be putting this on the back of a wagon or per se above a campfire with a lot of smoke to dry this all out. We are using the 21st century variation of it. However, I can tell you that it is possible to do the old method while making this. And that transitions us into me magically having a drying rack, which is exactly what you're going to lay those thinly sliced pieces of bison on, and you're going to put it in the oven. Now, this is the part where you go turn on your oven, you put it to the lowest temperature. Mine is at, I think, 160, 170. I don't quite remember what exactly the temperature is, but you want it at a very low heat. I got confirmation that it is at 170, so I put it in for 170, and I tested it at about 10 hours. I left it in for about 10 and a half. That is what you're going to want to do in terms of what the consistency should look like when you pull it. So we have a nice, long, flat, rectangular piece here. We'll start with that because it is the easiest. And all you're going to do is slice very thin strips. It does make this a little bit more difficult because we are cutting into a slice of steak instead of a big roast, which makes this a little bit more difficult to get very fine, thin strips. So my little workaround is get a strip like that, and then take the edge of your knife and just flatten it out. So you have something that looks like this. It's not incredibly paper thin. Unless you have a deli slicer, I suspect that if you're doing the exact same thing I'm doing right now, that is ultimately what they're going to turn out and look like. Let's see if we can get a little thinner, but I will let you know in the meantime. The other thing is you don't want to kill the bison twice. Be very gentle with it, you're in no hurry. This food will last you, in a dry place of course, over a year, maybe even longer than that. That's a little finer right there. That's what you're looking for, and you're just gonna set it on the drying rack. This is also a good time to note that you're going to want an extremely sharp knife because you are going to have a hell of a time getting these thin little cuts if you have something that couldn't cut toilet paper. And it is also important to note that means that you are just dehydrating the ever-living hell out of the meat, that you should weigh how much you have for the future ingredient after you dry it out. You've ever seen on the McDonald's signs that it says it's a 1/4 pounder prior to cooking it. They weigh the meat prior to make you have the illusion that you're getting more food than you actually are. After it's done cooking, it's more of an 1/8 pounder. But that's not as catchy and probably doesn't bring in as much profit. If anybody's curious on trivia questions in regards to who I am, I'm not a fan of McDonald's by any stretch of the imagination. How is it that every time I do a cooking video, I always end up in a white shirt? Also, it is important to note when you're cutting the meat, try to cut against the grain. It doesn't really matter. I'm sure that you're gonna go back to the video here and see me cutting with the grain and be like, wow, stupid ass, like you're not even following your own rules. I got it. So I have completed the little drying rack full of sliced very thinly bison meat. And what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we're going to put it over the back of a wagon, or we're going to pretend that we're putting it over a very smoky fire, and we are going to dry this out. And the consistency needs to be drier than beef jerky. And you will see this here in a second, but when you pull it out of the oven after that 10 or so hours, or off the back of your wagon that you're drying this on, or over your campfire, it should be extremely brittle. There should be no bend to it. It should almost just crumble. So here, we're gonna pretend that we're waiting for this all to dry out, and we will come back after 10 and a half hours, and I will show you what it should look like. All right, it is clearly 10 and a half hours later, and this should be what you're looking for. Watch when I bend it, it falls apart. There is no room for error. It will just crumble. And that's exactly what we want to do with the final product. And also, this is why you get the fat off of your pemmican, or at least this pemmican at this stage. The reason for that is it does have a pretty putrid odor when you open up your oven. You should want to put a tray underneath it because it's going to drip miscellaneous fat that you did miss. And that portion of that does have a pretty bad scent to it. That's why you're trying to clear out all of the fat when you are refining the meat that you are drying. This is the portion where we are going to make sure that this is now the consistency of a very coarse flour. You're going to want to get it down to almost a powder. Now, normally in a historical fashion, you would use a mortar and pestle. I do not possess, nor have I looked for a mortar and pestle, but we are going to use the next best thing. Trust me, if you would like to do it historically accurate, a mortar and pestle would suffice, but we are just going to put it in a blender and we are just going to hit it into blend or grate. We'll try grate first, and then we'll move to blend if it is too coarse. And then I will show you what it should look like right before we add the fat. And look at there. There is some fine, ground up, almost a powder, bison meat. You can see there. And let's just dump it on our plate. Now you'll notice here that the pile of ground up bison doesn't seem to match what you saw go in the blender. I actually added more that I had ready in regards to making sure that this video didn't take 32 hours to film and it took 1 quick hour. But I added the other batch just because it was ready and the blender wasn't taking to such a minuscule amount of meat. This is also where, and this is the important part, if you would like to add like berries, which was historically choke berries from what I could find, into your pemmican, you could even add sugar or a little bit of salt, but salt wasn't predominantly used until like, you know, the latter half of the 19th century. So if you want to really go to mountain man or, you know, Native American ways, try to stay away from salt. I'm sure that salt, like we learned in previous videos, would go a long way, but if you want to stay historically accurate to making you know, pemmican as real to life as you could, I would try to stay away from salt and even sugar in some regards. So the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to take our ground up bison and we are going to put it in a bowl. And as I am speaking right now, I have some beef tallow over the stove top, and I'm getting it ready for the mixing portion. And this is the part of the story where I tell you that if you have rubber gloves or some like medical gloves that you can throw on, I would do so. I don't know how many times you guys have worked with melted animal fat and, you know, mixing it with your hands, but fat is extremely difficult to get off your hands once you apply it. But if you'd like to do it historically accurate, like I am about to do, I'm going in and I am doing it raw. I'm going to mix it, the fat and the powdered bison meat, I guess, bison meat powder. I'm going to mix it with my hands. I'm not going to add any fruits. I'm not going to add anything to it. It is just meat and fat, like I said at the top of the video. However, if you are going to use any sort of fruits, choose fruits that you enjoy and actually have a little bit of sugar to them, because I'm assuming it will greatly improve your final product. I do love pineapples, so I will make a variation with some dried pineapples. I am allergic to craisins or cranberries in general because of the skin that wraps the berry itself, but I bet this would add a nice bittersweet taste to your final product. These are the two that I will be adding. I can't necessarily eat cranberries, but my family can, but I will try some with pineapples. Not historically accurate, but they should stand the test this time all the same. Now, as I said, I am going to do this historically accurately. This is all animal fat, and I'm going to rearrange everything with my hands. I am going to make sure that the fat at a 1-to-1 ratio, as much meat as I have, I'm going to use that much fat. And then I have my little makeshift mold. Historically, you would use animal hide. You would use fur, but the fur side would be out, and the leather that the animal fur produces or the skin produces would be you sewing the pemmican. That's exactly what we're going to do, but we're just going to use a little mold because, I mean, unless you live up in northern Idaho and you're a fur trapper, I'm assuming you don't have any animal hide just lying around to sew the pemmican together. And those are the words off the recipe and historically used. You sew the pemmican together. I'm just going to use a mold and get it to its final state and let it dry, and then we will do our taste test, and I will have some different variations. As you saw that I had pineapple and cranberries. If you have choke berries, or I guess Saskatoon berries is another one, use those if you want the most historically accurate. If you want to make your final product a little bit more palatable, I suggest using those, but for the sake of 21st century pemmican, you can use pretty much whatever fruit is at hand. You can use a little sugar, use a little salt. But before this warms up and I have hardened animal fat, we should get to mixing this. 1-to-1 ratio, I have this is about 2.5 bison steaks at 8 ounces. This is where the math comes in. When you grill something or let it dehydrate such as that, you lose about half its weight. So 2.5, so we have what, 8, 8, and 4, that would be 20. We have about 10 ounces, give or take, of bison meat. So we're gonna need 10 ounces of tallow, or fat, or whatever you wish. And usually when I do that, I just imagine that I'm pouring it into a traditional 16.9 fluid ounce bottle of water, and you can just fill it up to about 2/3 the way. That would be roughly 2/3. Oh yeah, it's a mess, as I suspected. Make sure every piece of meat in here gets a good bath. You are gonna put it in a mold and you're gonna wait for it to dry out so it hardens, so it's like a little candy bar of meat. Little candy bar of meat, you know me, I love candy bars of meat. So you can see, look it, it's a mess. Probably should do it with gloves, but I love you guys too much. We're gonna be historically accurate. We're gonna place it in our mold. We're gonna flatten it down, and we're gonna wait for it to dry, and we will do a little taste test. Look at that. For you guys, that is going to go into my mouth, down my esophagus, and hit every taste bud that I currently possess. And there is your first little handheld piece of pemmican. Isn't that special? So if you add fruit to your pemmican, which I'm about to do to make a couple different variations for the end here when we taste it, you want it as fine as the meat itself, otherwise it will fall apart and you don't want it to do that. So make sure it is as fine as the meat that is going into, and I'm going to actually cut up some cranberries, cut up some pineapples here quick to add to this mix, because we already have our plain pemmican. Let's add a little flair to it. If you guys ever seen Office Space, make sure that there's enough flair. We're just gonna add cranberries to this one here. Not too many though, remember that. That is plenty. All right, here's the cranberry version here. I'm gonna put it in another mold, and we'll let it dry, and we'll get some audience participation and see if it's any good. There you go. That's what the mold looks like, and hopefully it takes. We'll actually add a little bit more so we can get like a little dome shape. And here it is. This is what pemmican looks like. It's in the shape of a mason jar lid, but that is the only mold that I have. If you'd like to put it in animal hide, then be my guest. That is all up to you. I guess the only thing left to do is to taste it. And mine has the blue toothpick in it, because if I were to eat that one, as I said, I would die. I guess we'll just take a little piece off here. And down the hatch. It's what I expected. It's edible. It doesn't have a bad taste. It doesn't have a necessarily good taste. It just tastes like really fatty meat. I would like to point out that, I mean, I might have left it in the post-production, but I said it's probably going to be extremely bland, and that is precisely what it is. It has no unique flavor. It has a tint of meat to it, but the tallow and the fat kind of coat your mouth. It's not as good as the cornbread. I thoroughly enjoyed the cornbread, and I really enjoyed the Hellfire stew. This is like the meat version of hardtack. It's just there to fill your tummy. That is strictly what this is for. I do know of rubaboo. I think that's what it is. Rubaboo, which is maybe we'll do that in the future where we make we'll actually make pemmican stew and add some actual ingredients to it. Salt would go a long way. I feel like I've said that before. But I'm sure sugar would also go a long way. For my final thought with me making pemmican today, I can see where, the Lewis and Clark expedition were firm believers in the pemmican. They would eat it quite religiously, and, meat was something that the explorers definitely wanted to put in their system. It would make a hell of a lot of sense to have a mess of this just lying around. There's a lot of protein. The fats are good for you, especially when you're exerting as many calories as somebody who would be, exploring the entire West. This would make a ton of sense to have on standby. It's not gourmet. It is certainly not gourmet. This is the furthest thing from, luxury. However, if you are in a pinch and the only thing that you have is pemmican, you could be doing a hell of a lot worse. It kind of just falls apart when you put it in your mouth. The fat is doing its job of holding all those little bits of meat together. But let's just say that if you're looking for fine dining one night, maybe you want to treat yourself after a long week of labor, I don't think pemmican would be on the menu. But if you were up against the wall in a survival setting, and maybe you're a backpacker through the backwoods and you just, use a topography map to get around, this would probably be a must-have in terms of your adventure. Anyway, that is the end of the video. We made pemmican today, and I would have to say that this is right in the middle. I'm pretty lukewarm on it. If I were backed up against the wall, like I said, using a topography map to get around, this would be ideal. This would be perfect. It gives you your protein, it gives you your fats. I would add berries if I was roaming to give you a little bit of extra. Maybe it'll actually go down the gullet a little smoother. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I'm pretty indifferent about it. But I'm glad that I tried it. This is the first time I've ever had it, and this is the first time I've ever made it. All that there is left to say is thank you everyone for coming along on this journey today. Please leave a like if you've enjoyed today's video, or leave me a comment stating what you liked, or tell me what I should make next. I have a Patreon that is linked down below in the description, or it's appearing at the bottom of my table right in front of the pemmican. If you enjoy the content that you see here on St. Andrew TV and would like to continue to support it outside of subscribing, please feel free to leave a donation over on the Patreon. I am community funded and community funded only. You will never see external forces influence the content in any direction. Everything here you see is grass-rooted and homegrown. However, that is not to say to feel any obligation to donate to the Patreon, only if your means allow you to do so. The content here on YouTube will forever remain free. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed as of late, but for those of you who have come across this channel, maybe because you like to learn how to cook new things, maybe you just wanted to have another frontier recipe that you could go off, make yourself, and try. Or maybe you just came across this video because you thought, I pemmican't. Well, I'm here to tell you that I pemmican. So please think about hitting that subscribe button, because you're a daisy if you do.